Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're joining us from. Welcome to the Accelerating Vaccination in Africa, the Role of the Private Sector webinar. As we begin, I would like to take us through the session ground rules. Attendees will be on mute during the session. The session will be in English. We request all the speakers to keep to the allocated time during the session. The session will be 90 minutes long, and you're encouraged to post your questions in the Q&A section, and they'll be answered as much as possible. And as you can see now, we have the program for the day. As I had said earlier, the session is a 90-minute session. And I would now like to introduce the co-moderators for the day. Dr. Amit Thacker is the Executive Chairman at Africa Health Business and is a groundbreaking pioneer in the integration of private sector within the health system in Africa. Dr. Thacker is also the President of the Africa Healthcare Federation. He is also well known as the founder and CEO Director of Avenue Healthcare, which was then integrated within the Avenue Group of companies. Our second co-moderator for the day is Mr. Kiplagat. He's the Group Director at Africa Practice, a Pan-African strategic advisory firm with offices in London, Dar es Salaam, Casablanca, Johannesburg, and Lagos. He was co-facilitator of the initial strategy workshops that led to the formulation of the Africa Union's Agenda 2063. Prior to joining the company, Richard worked with Microsoft Africa as the head of Global Strategic Alliances. He is currently chairman of the Unclaimed Financial Assets Authority Board. And now I'd like to welcome Richard to proceed with the webinar. Karibu, Richard.
Thank you, Jacob, and welcome to all of you that are joining us from all over the world. As was indicated, my name is Richard Kiplagat. I'm Group Director at Africa Practice, and I'm based in Nairobi. Africa Practice is a Pan-African strategic advisory firm working across the continent at the intersect of industry and government, and we provide insights and advocacy to help our clients navigate complex stakeholder ecosystems, public policy, regulatory affairs, and reputation. In partnership with Africa Health Business, we're delighted that over 150 participants have registered to join us in this important and timely discussion on the acceleration of vaccine rollout in Africa, and in particular, the role of the private sector. It's clear that all Africans, including the private sector, are anxious to see an end to the COVID-19 pandemic. The human and economic toll on the continent has been immense, and the urgency that drove the unprecedented public-private collaboration that led to the development, trials, and production of COVID-19 vaccines must surely be matched by an equally urgent rollout of vaccinations. Someone recently said that vaccines are not vaccinations. Today, over 1.2 billion vaccines have been produced and 860 million or so distributed. 95% of those have been to rich countries, and less than 1% have gone to Africa. We know that COVID somewhere is COVID everywhere, and that it's therefore our collective responsibility, globally and locally, to contribute to finding ways to end this terrible pandemic. During the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw African private sector support procurement of PPEs via initiatives such as the Africa Medical Supply Platform. In Kenya, my own organization, Africa Practice, joined with many others to supply soap, hand washing stations, masks, and to deliver behavior change communications. In Nigeria, the Private Sector Coalition Against COVID built isolation wards and equipped laboratories. And in South Africa, the Solidarity Fund raised over 200 million to support testing, procure ventilators, and distribute food relief. Our objective today is to bring various public and private sector stakeholders together to respond to the new challenge of rapid vaccination. and share ideas, best practices on how the private sector can help accelerate the rollout of vaccines on the continent. We do intend to take the discussion and recommendations that we hear from you and from the participants and compile a report that we can distribute to private sector leaders and policymakers and help inform decisions and urgent action. I look forward to the discussion and would now like to introduce to you our exciting panel. So to begin with, our keynote speaker today will be Dr. Ahmed Ogwelo-Uma, who's Deputy Director, Africa CDC. Dr. Ouma is an accomplished international civil servant and an expert in global health for the last 25 years. He has several competencies, including in governance in public health, partnerships and resource mobilization, health security, including health emergencies, the prevention and control of NCDs, building multi-sectoral partnerships, international cooperation across sectors, tobacco control, global health diplomacy, and the development of international instruments that impact positively on public health. Welcome, Dr. Ouma. Our second panelist is Lolem Ngong, who is Chief of Staff at AMREF Health Africa. Lolem is a seasoned global public health professional with over 15 years of leadership in global health diplomacy and coordination of strategic partnerships to address threats to public health. Ms. Ngong serves as Chief of Staff at AMREF Health Africa and is an epidemiologist by training. Ms. Ngong has advised and led collaborations with government, civil society, academic institutions, multilateral organizations, and international donors, and is therefore perfect for the perspectives we need during this webinar. Welcome, Ms. Ngong. And our third panelist is Mrs. Suad Aden Osman, who is Executive Director, Coalition for Dialogue on Africa. Ms. Osman is the Executive Director. She's also heads the Secretariat of the African Union High-Level Panel on Illicit Financial Flows in Africa. And in that capacity, she serves as the coordinator of the consortium to stem those flows from the continent. Under her leadership, CODA fostered the work of Afri-Exim Bank and the African Union Commission towards the establishment of the Africa Business Council. And she recently coordinated the preparation and adoption of the AU Assembly's Common Africa Position on Asset Recovery. Welcome, Madam Aden Osman. I would now like to hand over to my colleague and friend, Dr. Amit Thakkar, who will take over the moderation from here. Welcome, Amit.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you to the panelists and our keynote speaker for coming on stage today. And thank you all for logging in on this very important subject of vaccination, which is top of the mind for everyone in the global health space, and especially for the leaders of global health in Africa. Just almost a year ago, we only had 2 countries that could carry out PCR testing. And I remember there were many facilities and flights taking samples from the country where I'm in, Kenya, to South Africa to get a result. Wasn't long before organizations like Africa CDC ramped that up and started scaling, and almost 100% of the countries now in Africa are able to carry out PCR testing to a very high standard. Through 2 months into the pandemic, 100% of the tests by many countries were being done by public sector laboratories. In fact, all the tests, and many of you know what happened then. The private sector came into play and we enabled triple the number of tests to be done across many countries. And right now, many countries are reporting a 60-40 or a 50-50 in testing. What did this do? It allowed people to access testing so easily that you have people coming to collect specimens and getting your test done before you travel. You get your results, and we have this wonderful pan bios. I'm setting the stage where partnerships really helped. We're now being called again, once again, to scale up partnerships. We know government can't go it alone. 50% of the footprint on our continent for healthcare is through the private sector. We're very, very proud of the private sector growth on the African continent, not only in the urban, but also in the rural setup. We have already participated in many public health matters. This one is the largest test of the true partnership. As you heard from Richard, used to be 2% of the people vaccinated in the globe from Africa. And every day it's getting worse. And now we've recently seen the WHO article that says it's 1%. So every day something's not going right. Some people are getting vaccinations done and some populations are getting it done much quicker than what we are having. Our supply side is a major problem because the pharmacy of the world, India, has also hit challenges, which has been and is going to be a major supplier for COVAX. I know Dr. Ogwell is going to talk to us about alternative sources like AVAT, and we may need to go into the idea of manufacturing, and we need to be creative about increasing supply. But COVAX, talking about COVAX, and we must appreciate all the partners in COVAX. They've done a tremendous job so far in supplying millions of vaccines, have said 30% is what they would like to achieve at least by next year. We gathered here today to see how we can add another 30%. And literally 2/3 of Africa being inoculated will give us hope for the economy to open. And it's only when we come together we'll be able to increase the number of vaccinations that are then carried out through our countries. So today's webinar is exploring ways to accelerate vaccinations and what can we as private sector do and what are we called upon to create as novel partnerships that will enable us, bring us to safety. No one is safe until we are all safe. And to talk to us more about this is this esteemed panel. We couldn't have asked for better representation from across the continent with all sorts of expertise today. It's my pleasure and honor to invite a good colleague and friend of ours and mine, Dr. Ahmed Ogwell from Africa CDC. Ahmed, the stage is yours. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Amit, and thanks to both organization Africa Practice and AHB for putting this together. We are happy to be co-creating these conversations around the continent on not just COVID-19 and the vaccine, which is what we'll talk about today, but in general health security. Because at the end of the day, if we have a stable way of controlling our health security agenda on the continent, then our economic activities, our social activities will be able to thrive. If we don't, then the opposite will also be true. So it's a pleasure to be here today. I would like to touch on a few points, but first is to begin with the reality. The reality is that today we have documented about 4.7 million cases of COVID-19 on the continent. We all know that our testing is not where it's supposed to be. So these are indicative figures, if I may say so. We have lost just over 127,000 people on this continent to COVID-19. So it is a very significant public health problem. We have lost a lot of value in as far as economic activities are concerned. We have lost a lot of social connections due to the need for public health measures and the quarantining and the difficulties in travel and doing business. We've lost a lot in as far as social connections are concerned. Indeed, we have lost our innocence as a continent, that we will continue to rely on partners from outside. We have realized that unless we do it ourselves, it is not going to be done by anybody, because right now, everyone is very busy handling their own problems that have been brought about by the pandemic. So if there is one silver lining, it is that we have lost our innocence of the reliance on others, and we have to do it ourselves from here on. And we are very focused on that as Africa CDC. We are saying that we need to establish a new public health order where we as Africa take care of our issues. If someone is coming to support us, it is support, while we will already started doing what we need to do. For that, we need to build capacity. We need to work together more. We need to build our partnerships. We need to be awake to the facts of health security so that we can be able to be better planned and we can be able to take care of ourselves much better. Now, moving into vaccines and vaccination. On the continent, as of early this morning, we had imported, and that word is important, imported just over 38 million doses of COVID-19 vaccines of different types. Indeed, all types have reached the continent of Africa. Of these 38 million doses that we have imported, we have only vaccinated about 22 million doses have been put into people's arms. We have vaccinated roughly half of the doses that we have received. We have used them for vaccination. It tells you two things. One is that we are at the tail end. If there is somewhere beyond the tail, that is where we are in as far as receiving vaccines is concerned. We are 1.3 billion people, and we've received only 38 million doses. So we are far, far away from our target of 780 million people, making up about 60% of the continent's population. We are not doing well. That is one message. The second message is that even the little that we are receiving, we are not vaccinating. If we have received 38 million and we have only vaccinated about 60%, it tells you that the process of vaccination is very slow. And also to repeat that it is not vaccines that save lives, it is vaccination that saves lives. So those vaccines need to be in people's arms. They should not be in stores somewhere in Africa. So these two messages need to wake us up to the need for us to be more proactive in the way that we acquire vaccines, in the way that we invest in the infrastructure for delivering these vaccines, and in the way that we do our vaccination on the continent. A continent of 1.3 billion should not have a problem utilizing 38 million doses of vaccines. Which brings me to the conversation of the role of the private sector. Let me say from the outset that the kind of outbreaks, the kind of health emergencies that we face on this continent cannot be able to be tackled by government alone. The kind of health security challenges that we face on this continent cannot be able to be tackled by us ourselves as Africans alone, because of the way that the world is interconnected, because of the way that we remain traveling back and forth between countries, between continents. We cannot be able to do it alone. But that partnership, the way in which we'll be doing it with others, the way in which we'll be doing it between public and private sector, needs a framework that is organized so that everyone knows what their role is, so that everyone knows what their timing for action is, and so that everyone knows what they need to contribute in as far as achieving a stable health security agenda on the continent is concerned. Where we are today with COVID-19 vaccines is a place which is extremely difficult, Vaccine nationalism has taken root globally. Those who have manufacturing facilities are not sharing with those who do not have. Those who have access to more resources are buying up all the available doses, and only little is coming in through the different mechanisms that I will talk about shortly. We have three main paths of accessing vaccines on the continent of Africa. First is the COVAX facility, which is really a conglomeration of partners who are buying vaccines and then making it available to less endowed countries, those who have resource problems, like many countries here on the continent. Now, the COVAX facility, unfortunately, the backbone of the COVAX facility was the AstraZeneca vaccine. And the factory that was to be used to manufacture these vaccines was and is the Serum Institute in India. Unfortunately, the Indian government has issued an edict which prohibits export of any vaccines. It means the COVAX facility is therefore paralyzed as a result of the non-export of COVID-19 vaccines from the Serum Institute in India. At the moment, they are busy negotiating with other manufacturers, and we hope some doses will become available soon. The second is the AVAT mechanism. This is the Africa Vaccines Acquisition Task Team, which was set up by our heads of states at the Africa Union, and which we as Africa CDC are coordinating. The AVAT mechanism has an agreement with the Serum Institute in India, but again, our doses could not be able to be delivered in time before that edict was pronounced by the government of India. We are now negotiating with Johnson & Johnson and other manufacturers so that we can be able to get as many doses onto the continent as possible in the shortest possible time. The third way of acquiring vaccines on the continent is bilateral, whether it is bilateral purchase or bilateral vaccine diplomacy donations. All these are packaged into the bilateral way of getting vaccines onto the continent. But this still makes a very small percentage of the vaccines that we are acquiring. Largely, they will come through COVAX and the AVAT mechanism. Now, the context in which we are, vaccines for COVID-19 are extremely rare. They are a very rare commodity, and there's a scramble globally to be able to get to those commodities. In this way, as Africa Union and as Africa CDC, we have encouraged the manufacturers to focus on the COVAX and the AVAT mechanisms for getting vaccines onto the continent. And the reason for that is really quite simple. One is equity. And we have been saying this from the rooftops, that we need equity in vaccine access for the continent. This situation where you have 12-year-olds in New York getting vaccinated, while a health worker in Gabon or Equatorial Guinea or indeed in Kenya is not getting a vaccine, is bizarre, to say the least. It is completely unacceptable that we would have non-essential workers, indeed children, being vaccinated, while essential health workers in the front line of battling with COVID-19 do not know when they will get their first shot of a COVID-19 vaccine. It is as close to immoral as it gets. And it is our position as Africa CDC that equity must be exercised so that we can be able to bring this pandemic to a stop everywhere around the world. You can never stop a virus from crossing borders. You can never be able to stop trade from continuing. You can never be able to contain any health outbreak unless you stop it across the globe. So this is our position as Africa CDC. It is also important to note that apart from equity, which we have been talking about, we are also encouraging governments to, at this stage of controlling the pandemic, that governments need to take charge and ensure that there are enough vaccines for its citizens to cover at least 60% of the citizens. And the reason for this is threefold. One is we want to make sure that there is equity within the country, so that those who have and those who don't have any money will still be able to access the vaccine. This is one. Second is so that we can be able to ensure that the most vulnerable, whether they are health workers at the front lines or whether they are those who are old or with comorbidities, they get their vaccine earlier than those who are relatively fit and can be able to wait for vaccines a little bit later. So this is the second reason why we want governments to take charge. The third is the extremely risky business of not being able to confirm whether a vaccine is efficacious and safe or not. Is it the original thing that you're getting into a patient's arm? Is it the actual vaccine? When governments are in charge, we expect that their sources of getting the vaccines will be genuine, the transportation methodology will be clear, and the vaccination points are going to be very known because the government will have announced it. Any departure from this allows for crooks to get in and start cheating members of the public, and we are quite stringently against that. What we are not against is the private sector playing a productive role in ensuring that vaccination is fast so that we can be able to contain the pandemic quickly. We are not, we in fact encourage the private sector to play its role so that the distribution within the country and the vaccination happens as quickly as possible. We are encouraging the private sector to support government efforts in as far as acquisition of vaccines is concerned. And the sources of acquiring those vaccines need to be the well-established sources, and the AVAT mechanism under the Africa Union that we are coordinating is where I will recommend that you go for that. We are discouraging purchase of vaccines off, whether it's the black market or the white market, but vaccines that are purchased on the side, outside of established pathways, are dangerous and risky because they can be able to open up the doors for spurious products and fake vaccines reaching shores, and this will completely destabilize the momentum that we have gained in as far as controlling this pandemic is concerned. Finally, moderators and ladies and gentlemen, what I would like to say is we need, and quite urgently so, to get good functional frameworks developed by governments so that the regulatory process within a country is clear on who imports vaccines, so that the health authorities within a country have designated which are the points that people need to go and get vaccinated, so that the prioritization is clear. So that irrespective of who is giving the vaccine, the priority groups are the ones who receive it first. And having a lot of money is not a criteria in as far as we are concerned for being first on the queue in as far as getting the vaccine is concerned. So the governments need to be responsible and in charge of that. The private sector needs to support government in doing that. And we have many different models that we know work. As the Africa Vaccine Acquisition Task Team, we are very, very keen to see that where governments have allowed the private sector to participate in acquiring vaccines on behalf of the government, then our platform is ready to facilitate that so that private sector can be able to support government efforts in acquiring more vaccines. It is timely that the private sector is a part of this process. It is timely that only genuine private sector players are allowed into this space. It is timely that members of the public get to know exactly what is going into their arms, and that can only be assured by a very clear regulatory mechanism that government should be able to establish. But private sector, if the pandemic continues, you will not be able to do your business. Members of the public, if the pandemic continues, you will not be able to go back to your new normal life. So it is extremely important that we work together and ensure that we get more vaccines onto the continent and into people's arms as fast as possible. But public health measures must continue to be respected, because that is what is free, and we can all be able to do it. Social distance, wear your mask, wash your hands with soap, avoid crowded places, and please provide the correct information. If you have it, if you don't have it, don't share what you're not sure about. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ahmed Ogwell. The message was crystal clear. What I'm taking back from your address, where the two panelists will also add, at the private sector is now welcome. It must play within a framework. I think I really took a message that you're discouraging any side markets. These side markets can hamper and destroy any kind of process, especially if you get spurious products coming through with counterfeits. I also took back that being genuine and being very concerned about the eligibility criteria across the entire continent is critical. You even hinted that it's not payment that should get you access to the vaccine, but you facilitate payment for those who are health vulnerable in order to protect our health systems even further. You also talked about acquisition, and you encouraged us to look at AVAT as a mechanism, and we support you. And because the vaccines are a rare commodity, I think combined we shall work together in pushing the percent of AVAT as well as bilateral mechanisms. You talked about philanthropy. There are so many people who've logged in, as you can see, are from the philanthropy space. Many of the people who are on the call today are people who have helped healthcare, education, and so many other sectors. So I want to thank them. And I think this is the time we can stand to be counted. I really, really thank you for setting this stage up, because this will be a good time for us to bring in Lolem Gong, who's been 15 years in leadership in the global health diplomacy. And Lolem is actually the Chief of Staff at the AMREF Health Africa. Lolem, you know, Ahmed also mentioned that we have 38 million vaccines, but only 60%. Where is the absorption capacity? That means if we had 380 million, how many would have expired? Maybe on our shelves. And then the people in New York, the 12-year-old would say, I'd rather have the jab in my arms than have it expired in Malawi. So I think we need to change the equation. And you are literally in the grassroots. You are in the at places where there is a lot of maybe thinking and hesitancy. Tell us, Lolem, what is happening on the ground, and also tell us how should we get the messaging out, and are we missing the boat when it comes to communication and PR? Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to on the stage, Ms. Lolem Gong. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Amit, and thank you, Richard, as well, and all the organizers, the co-organizers of this really, really informative webinar. I'm already learning a lot just from Dr. Ahmed's keynote address. And yes, that percentage is really striking, just the fact that we do have some vaccines, very limited, in stock, that have arrived on our shores, but we've only administered a little over 50% of those vaccines. So you're absolutely right, Amit. It begs the question of what is happening? Why are we not absorbing? And then how do we still position ourselves to get more vaccines when we're not absorbing the limited quantities that we have? And so this, of course, raises all the issues around vaccine hesitancy. We know vaccine hesitancy remains a global challenge. We also know very clearly, and not only as pertains to the COVID vaccination, but also to other vaccines, that for us to attain any form of herd immunity, we must succeed at demand generation. And what that means is we do have to work extremely hard to combat vaccine hesitancy. So in our work at AMREF, as we talk to our community health volunteers, community health workers, as we engage with our communities, and this is ranging from when we started supporting testing interventions to present, as we encourage communities to go for vaccination, for COVID vaccination, and to access the COVID vaccination as limited as the quantities are. I think there are three key areas that I would like to highlight as we think through hesitancy. So one, what we're finding, we've done a few studies, and what we're finding is that there've been really little effort to increase demand generation from the start of the pandemic. And when we started talking about the vaccine, I think there was so much momentum and so much excitement over getting the vaccine that we forgot about vaccination. And as Dr. Ahmed reminded us, vaccines don't exist in a vacuum. You do need vaccination. You need to make sure that you get the vaccine in arms. And so we forgot about all the things that come with ensuring that one person gets vaccinated. And so just specifically on demand generation, we started very late in communicating, in really putting together very robust community engagement models or leveraging existing modules. And these are very important, as we know. And as we're seeing, for communities, for people to understand even the basic eligibility criteria, for people to understand why their neighbor is eligible in phase 1, but they're not eligible, just those basic things on scheduling, where do they go to get a vaccine? What are the possible side effects? Understanding safety concerns. We've seen this come up again and again as we're witnessing this infodemic. So that's one area that I think it's a cause of vaccine hesitancy. Then a second part, which is very much linked to poor efforts around demand generation, is also just around planning. You heard Dr. Ahmed talk about vaccine equity within countries. So we've talked about this global vaccine equity, but then even within our countries, how are we ensuring that vaccines are getting from, the urban hubs to some of the rural areas? And that also contributes to vaccine hesitancy, because there isn't a shared understanding of how those vaccines will move. Well, if they sat in one area for too long, are they still safe enough to get into my arm? So these questions will come up if we don't plan properly and link and ensure that the citizen, that the layman understands why there are even certain delays in getting the vaccine to them. And then the third point to make is just around, which contributes to hesitancy, is our workforce. We recently just did a cross-sectional study in Kenya, in 4 counties, and we're looking at vaccine hesitancy among community health workers, and found that there was hesitancy among 19%. There was a really wide range of 9 to 42%, but 19% were hesitant to take the vaccine. So we can only imagine if you're if a healthcare worker is hesitant to take the vaccine, what about the rest of us who are not in this health space? So part of what contributes to hesitancy too is our workforce, educating our workforce, training our workforce, and equipping them with what they need to properly engage our communities. And so I just wanted to highlight those three reasons for why we're seeing vaccine hesitancy. Of course, there's quite a long list. And so when we look at the role of private sector, and also thinking again about that percentage, that is, we've only administered a little over 50% of the supply we have. And as we wait for more vaccines to reach our shores, we must also work hard, as I mentioned before, to consume what we already have. And so for the private sector, I think there are three areas where there's definite room for collaboration. And as we're also thinking through this framework for private sector engagement. So one is increasing affordability and access points for vaccination. I think just as public-private partnerships worked and contributed to an increase in increase in access to testing for COVID, the private sector can also help us do the same in increasing access points for vaccination. So that would mean providing vaccination in private facilities, making sure that those private facilities that are providing vaccination services are also prepared and are well-trained, have all the necessary accessories, including cold chain storage, appropriate certifications, and so on. Then the second one is to really support demand generation activities. And I've already mentioned that this is really one of the key contributors to vaccine hesitancy. So we would ask the private sector to really support allocation of resources to train and support community engagement, particularly of community health workers as they go door to door, encouraging communities to get vaccinated. And as we know, the more informed a health worker is, the more likely they will be able to accept the vaccine and to readily engage and mobilize communities to be vaccinated. And this also goes with even sponsoring, even just basic activities such as radio ads or newspaper. I mean, just, wherever the community receives their information, I think private sector can really play a very significant role in pushing demand generation activities. And then lastly, and I'll stop, is supporting vaccine research and development and vaccine manufacturing. As we've heard several people speak, not only in this forum, but in other forums on vaccination, and even just in thinking through pandemic preparedness. It's not, if the next one will come, but when it comes. So how do we already start preparing? And I think that's what Dr. Ahmed was alluding to in the new, a new public health order for Africa. It is that preparedness. So as private sector supports vaccine research and development and manufacturing, this becomes very important because we also need for our populations to be sensitized on even vaccine trials and the phases of vaccine development, so that before the next pandemic comes and hits our shores, we have a better understanding of why a vaccine, why certain public health measures need to be in place. And then people adhere because they understand and because this has almost become the norm for them. So Amit, maybe I'll stop there, and I'm really excited to be part of this panel and look forward to questions from the audience. Thank you.
Yeah, no, we are excited that you're part of this panel. We are learning a lot. Let me thank you for those 3 points. They were very clear, actually, talking about affordability, spot on. You also talk about demand generation and the vaccines that you talked about, the hesitancy. You also talked about supporting manufacturing. And I think what you've done is you've framed that it's complex. The only thing about this health system, it's not just simply getting the vaccine, it's the entire process. And this is where I think leaders like Suad Aden will add more value. And it segues very nicely to a health leader on the continent. Suad Osman is the executive director at the Coalition for Dialogue on Africa. And, it's really we're really glad to have you here today. And you've heard both Ahmed and Lolem speak about framing where the whole traction is. What initiatives is CODA involved in currently to ensure these vaccine equity? Ahmed has touched a little bit on eligibility. Lolem has also talked about making sure there's demand generation and affordability. And what are we going to do as CODA? And then while you are at that, Suad, also tell us, what is your ask from the private sector? I've seen so many. I can actually recognize at least 27 countries that have logged in from Africa. And I can see leaders from the private sector. I can see philanthropists. I can see champions who have led so many initiatives. So your ask from them would also be very useful. Let me invite you to stage. Suad Aden, over to you. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Amit. And I agree. You know, I should have come, and I am coming after Ahmed because I work for CODA. CODA is the Coalition for Dialogue in Africa, a platform for dialogue and debate, open and frank dialogues and debate that was established about more than a decade ago as an initiative of the African Union. It operates as an independent institution, although based at the African Union, as an independent platform in our thinking, in our proposals that we usually get through the African Union processes and procedures. And that is, we are focused on policy making, making sure that effective policy making and policy implementation is actually the main focus. And the reason why we are at the AU and not with the other three institutions that are our funders, African Union, African Development Bank, Afreximbank, and the UN Economic Commission for Africa, is because we recognize that African Union is the premier policy organ of the continent. It's important that we keep it that way because coherence with other policies is always important. And not only that, considering the level of poverty and the issues that we have on this continent, the magnitude of anything we touch must be dealt with first and foremost on a solidarity basis, because whether we like it or not, we do have many very small, weak economies on the continent where even the capacity to do anything lacks. So where we're talking about how, when we wanted to make sure that effective policy making, effective policy implementation happens, we target 5 countries and we are almost halfway. So the question then is, when we are now in the middle of a global pandemic, the equity issues that my brother Ahmed Ogwell from Africa CDC described ably shows that the extent to which the multilateralism as it exists doesn't deliver for the continent, right? Because of the history we came from and where we are even now. This is a continent where anybody comes. Mother Africa is open to business, has been open to business for centuries. So we have this habit of getting people come and take what they want from this continent without necessarily delivering neither for the continent governments nor for its people. In other words, African problems, until they are met with African solutions, we're not going to solve our problems. And definitely to make sure that we come up with a set of concrete and practical solutions, governments cannot do that unless and until policy making meets the interest and can motivate its private sector. We're not there and we won't get there. I'm happy to see one of the messages in the chat that questioned why Africa CDC is talking about frontline as frontline health service people, when really to say we are going to target the reopening of our economies, we wanted our workforce to be the target. Workforce level cannot be something that government alone can deal with, right? Hundreds of millions of Africans that need to go to work. How many Africans could stay home even under a hard lockdown? People go out, go to market to make a living on a daily basis. So even the basics of following global standards that are based on the needs and the way other societies are structured have not been delivering for this continent. So to solve in the middle of a global pandemic, problems that are structural, that we have been struggling with for more than 6 decades, cannot happen in Addis Ababa. It is that recognition that brings an African Union initiative, CODA, and we had organized the last month and with the African Center, the Africa CDC, a dialogue on equitable access to vaccines and vaccination. And one of the main things that came out, we had targeted community leaders, faith leaders, civil society, youth, media, scientists, academics, to discuss what Africa needs to do to cater for the vaccination needs of its populations. And as a follow-up to that dialogue, CODA triggered one of its initiatives at the level we usually trigger our initiative, and assembled a multidisciplinary team of experts who will be working together with the private universities and private businesses in Africa to independently reflect and take the time to engage all relevant stakeholders on vaccine production and distribution on the continent. The initiative will be launched next month at the Igbinedion University, Okada in Nigeria, and will emphasize the much needed momentum for Africa to leap forward on vaccine production. We are determined to make sure that we also mobilize all the networks, and I'm happy you're the one who is asking the question as a son of the continent who triggered on your own something that is important. You are one among the many that are part of the task team to make sure that we close the vaccination gap, because we realize that government alone, as Ahmed said, cannot solve this problem and cannot find the solutions, nor would the AU level solutions that are as much as continent-wide AU solutions are needed. We also understand that they go through a process to build the consensus we need to make them precisely continental-wide solutions. In other words, they become naturally a one-size-fits-all route to structural issues, which is usually very difficult to see through the implementation and the effectiveness of that. What happens at regional level, when we take it to the translation at the national level, because whether we like it or not, policy is a national matter, that translation is usually where we lose actually the understanding of even the challenges at national level, because taking it one way works among diplomats in Addis and and we discuss and try to bring solutions that would work. So we are getting a little bit more specific to make sure, for example, that when we say we wanted to call on the private sector, we also at the same time need to make sure that the solutions that are being proposed are done in by way of saying we fully understand the challenges that the private sector have, and that the gaps that we are seeing and we have established in the most independent way are attended to, and that the private sector interest and motivation will be triggered by this kind of policy. If we are not that precise, then as far as we are concerned, finding a quick solutions because we are in the middle of a crisis will not solve the structural problems we have been dealing with for decades. In other words, our initiative is going to make sure that the private sector can actually play the role we want them to play. What does it take? How is the private sector engaging the policy making, whether it's national level or regional level? We will be making sure that we attend to that. The main thing is that the reason why we are going to Nigeria and we're going to Igbinedion University Okada, the first private university of Nigeria, is precisely because it has been funded by our benefactor, a philanthropist of a different nature altogether, and we wanted to explore what it takes for the private sector, the nexus of the private sector, philanthropy, policy making, research will come when they come together, what they can do on this continent. So I say that CODA is a platform for dialogue and debate. And since I am the last speaker, because CODA also picks up a little bit of controversies most of the time, my question I would be even immediately to the previous two speakers is, what is it that we are really saying? Not to necessarily only to the private sector, because we need to be consistent when it comes to the narrative. When we have to take a step back and ask ourselves what it is that we are really saying to anyone, to any stakeholder. Now we want to talk to the private sector. Are we saying that the vaccine hesitancy is fueled by only by lack of proper communication? Or are we really saying that we are not vaccinated enough on this continent only precisely because because of the issue of availability of doses, and because when we have the little that comes on the continent that is already not enough, we are not able to put it in the arms of people. So then what is it that we are saying? So the clear message to the private sector, so for them to be able to determine what it is to be done. We cannot go all over the place when it is that I come back to the question of the asks. The ask, are we asking the private sector to bring their money so that the financing and procurement issues around the vaccination and in terms of quantity and equity can be met? Yep. Or are we saying that we wanted to communicate and we are not able to convince our people that this is there? Thank you, Hamid. I will be able to answer questions.
I think those are very, very clear points, and I think some of them are extremely controversial. And I do feel that this topic cannot be covered in 90 minutes. There are some very interesting questions that I want to start with. I think the first one I want to spin to Dr. Ahmed Ogwell, and this is somebody from Safaricom. And Benjamin has joined us from Safaricom and has asked an important question. One is about the pooling mechanism of COVAX. You know, you talked about the mechanics of realization on how to get, you talked about the three levels, COVAX, AVAT, and bilateral. So Safaricom is wondering, can they engage in a country-specific purchase? And as you answer that, can you also answer the eligibility criteria? The private sector who've logged in are also thinking, if I raise $500,000 or $1 million or some money, and I feel that my staff should get some protection for the commitment that I've given, take Safaricom for example, and I can use half for my staff and their families, and I use half for the eligibility criteria of maybe above 58, above 50, and frontline workers. So it's a mixed eligibility approach. Let's hear your views about that.
Thanks, Amit. These Kenyans, they always ask very difficult questions. One day I will revoke my citizenship. Okay, so two very good questions. The first is, in as far as purchase is concerned, and I see Benjamin is referring to COVAX. What I will say is, Safaricom, I encourage you to use the AVAT mechanism and not the COVAX one, because the AVAT mechanism is specifically for African countries. COVAX is global. Yeah. So that will be my encouragement. Second, tied to the first question is, if you want to choose a particular country, let's say Safaricom was interested in putting their, let's call it $2 million into the Kenyan allocation. Yes, it is possible. And it is very straightforward. What we do is, for each and every negotiation that we do, and we receive a commitment, for example, Johnson & Johnson commitment of 220 million doses, we allocate those as per population across the continent. And then the country comes and confirms their allocation. Now, at the time of payment, then Safaricom will tell the government that, look, we have this $2 million, we'll pay part of your allocation. And then you pay it into our account at Afrexim Bank, and that is secured for that particular country for those number of doses that that amount can be able to purchase. So it is possible to be able to do that. And yes, please use the AVAT mechanism because it is specifically for Africa. Thank you.
Any comments on the rate of Afrexim Bank? Have we sort of negotiated? Is it going to be reasonable funding, or are we going to be hit with an interest rate on dollars that's high? And then just speak a little bit about eligibility expansion.
The rates are very good. They are much better than what you will get out there. And the countries that have already done the sign up with Afrexim Bank are very happy with it. And it is a sliding rate. And if my memory serves me right, I think it's between 2 and 5%, depending on how long you will take to repay. If you take a short time, then it is a low rate. If you take a longer time, then it is a little bit higher. But I have not seen anything above 5% so far. Now, in as far as you said it was eligibility for,
let's say, you pay $2 million or the $1 million we talked about Safaricom, but yes, many of their staff are below 58. Many of their staff don't have pre-existing conditions, and they do want that safety embedded so the economy goes. What's your view about opening that eligibility?
Our position as Africa CDC is one of prioritizing groups of people based on their importance to the economic recovery, because we are doing all this so that we can be able to go back to our new normal.
Correct.
And those criteria are set by governments, but generally in Africa, it has been very consistent. Health workers in the front line first, frontline workers who are non-health workers, and then older people, because they're the ones who are hardest hit in as far as serious illness and deaths are concerned. And those will be generally about people above 55, 58 and above. Those are the ones who will fall into that criteria. Then those with comorbidities. Now, we leave the detailed negotiation between the government and the private sector. We don't have any hard and fast recommendation there. One recommendation we have is follow your criteria, which the government has set. But if, for example, Safaricom will negotiate with the government that, look, we have bought, let's say, 10,000 doses, give us 1,000 to give to our workers. This is something that can be able to be done with the government in concern. What we are discouraging is that situation where a 12-year-old is getting jabbed, while a 72-year-old who is still productive does not have access to the vaccine. This will not be acceptable at all. So that negotiation, we leave it with the government, but we encourage that those who are most at risk are the ones who are covered first, and then the rest will be able to follow. But Safaricom, it will not be a good image for a 23-year-old Safaricom worker to get jabbed, while a 42-year-old nurse will not have received the jab yet. That will not be very good optics. So the choices need to be very careful, need to be discussed with the government.
Very clear. And I think I really like the optics angle of it. And there's also the reality. We want everybody vaccinated, but I think the optics of progression will help us maybe manage inequity. Thank you, Ahmed, for that. Those very, very good remarks. Let me bring in Lolem. There are questions coming in, Lolem, about religious leaders, communities. There are many other people who, how do we make the civil society more engaged, the religious society, and maybe make the demand generation happen? There is a question that's on the chat box. Over to you. And I think that's come from Janine, Mama, Nicole. You've seen Nicole's question. So over to you. Can you hear us?
Sorry, Amit, my internet dropped for just 1 second. I promise I was not trying to escape the question.
What can we do? What can we do with religious leaders, civil society to actually, what's your view?
Sure. I think that's a really good question. I did see that in the chat. Religious leaders are community leaders. I think the beauty of engaging them is that this is not the first time that we've had to engage these group of leaders in public health, in any type of public health intervention. And there are also structures that already exist, right? So for example, with community leaders, they have a form of governance, whether it's for their gathering or with how they disseminate information within communities. It is the same way with faith leaders. So the starting point really is co-creating with them, being able to sit with religious leaders, various community leaders, even including traditional healers, whom we don't. That group has not come up as much in the conversations, but sitting with them to co-create the best vehicles to disseminate this information to their group. So whether it's their congregation, whether it's their micro loan savings groups, in Cameroon, we call those jangies. So how do you engage within those saving groups as you're discussing other happenings in life, of course, very much socially distanced, but how do you still pass on that information? I think with engaging those leaders, it's not about creating a new way, but it's now saying, this is what this virus looks like. This is why we need to vaccinate our populations. This is what vaccines mean. This is why vaccines work. And so then here's all the information you need. What else do you need from us? Or how can we support you to ensure that your constituency gets that information?
Mm-hmm.
There was also a question, I believe, on, when we talk about civil society, does that also include the private sector? And in some cases, and it also ties into this question on how do you engage different leaders? Because in some cases, yes, civil society might be private sector depending on their structure, but nonetheless, there's always a very big role for civil society organizations, whether these are, professional associations and, other kind of advocacy associations. The leaders of those groups can be engaged in a similar fashion to ensure that they're well equipped with the messages needed to encourage populations to take up vaccines.
Thank you. Thank you, Lolem. That was shedding quite a bit of light on that subject. Let me bring Suad Osman now on the stage. Suad, there's a question. Are we just doing talk and there's no action? Are we going to become NATO? NATO stands for no action, talk only. And on manufacturing, we have a question from Nigeria, as you have seen, from Nonso Dumania, who's asking, in the new public health order that Ahmed was talking about, are we really going to be involved in the direction of manufacturing, upgrading health systems to tackle this pandemic and other pandemics that we've heard are coming up? Where do you think we are going in this, or are we moving in circles? Over to you.
To me, at the policy level, that conversation will take us back to the conversation around industrialization, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a structural issue that we have been struggling with. Because even our roads, and that's why we were saying, what is it that we're really telling the private sector to react to? If we're telling them that even when we get very little number of doses, we cannot get them in the arms of people, it means that we are still having the same problem of infrastructure. That is also hampering this particular, not only. So our economies remain small. We trade only raw commodities. Our roads are made to take from inside to the ports because it's how we were organized during colonial days. So that those concerns that we are having and we are trying to attend to now are the same as what we have been trying to attend to that we have not done. That's why we think that really this pandemic is a wake-up call to Africa. Is an eye-opener to very many. It used to be dealt with, as I said, in Addis Ababa, in places where African Union organs, other institutions, development people have been are very socialized with these issues, but the larger population wasn't. Now we are all there. So we think that this is where, as much as public health is very precious, right? It is now brought to the fore. It is too precious to be ignored. That's what the pandemic is supposed to teach us. And that it affects every aspect of our life. That's what this global pandemic is actually going to teach us. Now, whether we are going to be able to attend to this with a set of forward-looking, practical, sustainable initiatives that are based on culturally acceptable principles and in line with the visions of African Union, Africa Agenda 2063, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the 2015 Addis Ababa Action Agenda. All of these instruments, decisions have been made, the solutions were known. We, as I was saying, failing in translating them into concrete things that our people feel or see.
Right.
Now, we are now seeing how these interdependencies that people like Ahmed and others at the AU have been advocating for decades are now a reality in the lives and livelihoods of people.
Yeah,
so,
true.
So what is it that we are going to do next? I think that if we put down the confusion of typical Africans will look for solutions abroad, but these importing solutions never dealt with issues on the ground. As I was saying, WHO type of lockdown and barrier measures, how many of those could be observed in our markets? How many Africans could stay home or stay away from some? What does it mean in slums? What does it mean in a household of 12 people in 2 rooms? What does it mean? It can't mean much. So the question then is the same. We will continue to need proper cooperation at regional, among countries, etc., at global level, support and backing of the private sector to achieve the goals of equitable access to the vaccine. Even me as an African wanted to ask my brother Ahmed, when we continuously say AVAT, or many people feel that we are going back to the same circle. Why? Because we are still, of course, you're a firefighting unit now because we're in the middle of a crisis, so we're dealing with it. But that's why this initiative that we're trying to launch is a forward-looking one. Let us not get again into saying our solutions should be either AVAX or COVAX. To me, this is poor people conversations. Honestly, we are taking and we are accepting the mindset that we are so poor that it's only through charity from the West and whatever space, whether it's policy or others that they give us, that is the only space in which we operate. We need to withdraw and take a step back and say, okay, forward-looking. Nobody has solutions even to this pandemic. Of course, it will not come from the AU. It will not come from anybody alone. It will come from all of us putting our heads and hands and heart together and to make sure that, but if we are going to tell the private sector how we wanted to be dealing with the quantity and equity issues that this pandemic brought about, well, then is the private sector an integral part of the policy making.
Right.
Many of you heard about the Africa Business Council, for example.
Right.
To us, a major instrument of the African Union, African continental free trade agreement.
Yeah.
Was a proof that was missing. With CODA stepped in saying, but you cannot drive this without a proper way of the private sector to engage the institutions and the processes of the AU. And how do you do that? Business councils at regional level exist, chambers of commerce exist, but what is it? Where is the private sector business support organizations even now in this conversation? Because we're saying private sector, what does it mean? We cannot talk to Safaricom alone. We cannot, that's not private sector. They are part of the private sector, but how do we engage and how do we make sure? So that's the kind of things that we will, but sadly, there is a great deal of mix up in the narrative. Precisely because we are on panic mode. So, but the players and the stakeholders, for all of them to come into this in a consistent, coherent, and in harmony. I wouldn't even go all the way to harmony, but at least consistent way of saying, here are a few solutions, without being necessarily crowded by the current problems that we are seeing that have been there. We cannot be dealing with the current problems that have been with us for 6 decades and taking the solutions, basically taking the same problems forward.
Sure, sure. Thank you. I agree with the person who wrote that this is profound. And I can see Claire Omatse from Nigeria. I see Dr. Arab. I see Dr. Wala from Kenya. And these are many, many more leaders in the private sector space. I've seen Nick Nesbitt from KEPSA. I've seen COMESA champion as an attendee. So what made it clear that, you know what, we need to have a new order also of partnership. Not only public health order, but I think a new order of partnership. We need to be on the table and engage more effectively. Dr. Ahmed, I want to take you back on the floor for a question before we go to the parting shots and close the session. Dr. Eva Jenga, who is, as you know, the chair of our regulatory space, is asking about the AMA treaty. And she's pushing a point. If the AMA, Margaret from the AU has been so busy, but the number of countries are very few, less than 10. Do you think it could have changed the whole dimension had the AMA treaty gone through? And while you're on the floor, also take Gillian Rainey, who's asking about third-party supply mechanism under AVAT, and if the private sector investors are interested in partaking of the supply of vaccines for government. I think you partly answered it, but you could ring fence the two questions of AMA and third-party mechanism. Ahmed, over to you.
Thanks, Amit, and thanks, Dr. Njenga, for that question. The simple answer is yes. If AMA were to be operational today, it would bridge a very big gap that we are facing in as far as the regulatory environment on the continent is concerned. So we are encouraging all countries on this continent to ratify the AMA treaty so that we can get ourselves one step closer to being able to manage our healthcare products issues a lot better. For Gillian, any opportunity for third-party supply mechanism? We as AVAT are, we don't want to characterize ourselves as a supply mechanism in that sense. What we are is we are facilitators for governments to be able to acquire safe and efficacious vaccines. The second thing that we have said is we are happy to work with private sector who are supporting government efforts for those vaccine doses to be able to reach at least 60%. So we don't engage with the private sector directly. What we do is we have the private sector to support government efforts to be able to acquire those vaccines. In that way, we will be happy to ensure that there are vaccines that country X can be able to acquire because the private sector has facilitated that payment. But for us to be a window where we actually sell directly to the private sector, this is the kind of thing that we are not mandated to do as AVAT, because that is a business transaction, and we are not mandated to do any business transactions, but we will facilitate private sector paying for a country's allocation or part of it, and that is going to ensure that we reach our 60%. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we are running out of time. As I mentioned, we can't cover everything. On the next slide, we will move to parting shots. We've tried to answer as many questions as we can. I will give 1 minute each to our panelists, and I'll start with in reverse order. So I'll go with Mrs. Suad Aden Osman. I would like to invite you as our first parting shot on stage, and then I'll go to Ms. Lolem, and then Dr. Ahmed. Suad, the floor is yours. Your take-home message for us.
Well, the take-home message, as far as CODA is concerned, is that we should not miss this opportunity to correct some of the views that we had about how we go about policy making. And nor should we be going away, whether we will be able to solve this dilemmas that we have been dealing with. At the end of the day, it's going to boil down to how we preserve our youthful population, and how and whether Africa will be able to devise its own solutions, even when it's very urgent. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Lolem, the floor is yours. Your message for us.
Thank you. I mean, every single sector has been affected by COVID, and so it is really upon all of us to ensure that we can contribute to controlling the pandemic. And it's not only, this pandemic now, and specifically with vaccines, ensuring that we get the vaccination right, and that we're able to accelerate the vaccination and lean on private sector. So it's not only leaning on private sector now, but it's also leaning on private sector to come in and be able to actively build systems with us, which can be activated for whenever we have the next pandemic. And with that, I thank you so much for this invitation and had an absolutely fantastic time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lolem. Ahmed, the floor is yours. What should we go home with today?
Thanks, Amit. Today, because we have a lot of private sector colleagues here, my message will be directly to the private sector. One is you are part of the society, and it is your duty. Indeed, it will be an honor for you to participate in increasing our vaccination to the 60% or more where it is possible. It is your duty. Indeed, it is your honor. This is the first message I'd like to say. The second is please support the government efforts so that we have a structured framework how we are going to reach that 60%. And finally is to ask you to ensure as we expand this space that we must avoid any activities that will result in substandard, spurious, falsely labeled, false, counterfeit products. We don't want any of that to get into a country, because if they do, it will lay to bear all the efforts that we've done so far, because people will not be protected. So as private sector, protect that area so that we do not end up with products that are not helpful. And finally, and this is to everybody, each one of us, we are the vaccine. Before you meet that vaccine, you are the vaccine. Do the right thing in as far as protecting yourself and others is concerned, and we will be able to slow down this particular pandemic until the actual vaccines arrive. I thank you.
Thank you. We are the vaccine. I think it's a real take-home message. And to the private sector, I think what Ahmed has also said is we are going to name and shame. We've been talking about this, Ahmed, among the various private sector chambers that have logged in. And we were thinking that if we start naming and shaming, any private sector caught with any falsified product or trying to make extra profits, no one in Africa is going to trade with them be it a listed company or privately exchanged. This pandemic will actually create an equalizer between men and boys. It will smoke out the cowboys and make the private sector trading system in Africa absolutely amazing. So we should start an index, and we should look at that. I think we can extend it to even public sector. So we can have a whole index of both public and private sector indexes that might help us. Let me invite on that point Richard Kiplagat, because Richard, in few minutes, if you can give us your closing remarks, and in the last minute, I'll give you the next action plan. Richard, over to you.
Thank you, Amit, and thank you to the panelists and to the participants for the great session. I really enjoyed the discussion, and I was really encouraged to hear Dr. Ahmed say that we are the vaccine, because as I mentioned, we were involved in behavior change campaign, and the slogan was Tiba ni Sisi, which in Kiswahili means the cure is us. We are the cure. So we are aligned, Daktari. We are very much aligned. I just wanted to really, my job is really quite simple, and I don't really want to summarize everything that has been said today. But I do want to say how important the messaging has been around the need for private sector to engage, that there is a way, there are platforms and opportunities for private sector to engage and contribute. We spoke broadly of three broad areas around supply and access to vaccines via the AVAT mechanism, and opportunities to fund supply of vaccines. Important to do so that through structured frameworks, so that we don't allow for illicit supply to creep in, profiteering, and other potential problems that will drive inequality, that will make us lose the efficacy of policy around prioritization, and that potentially reduce the efficacy of what we're trying to do across the continent. We also heard how important it is for private sector to participate actively in demand generation around the use of vaccines. We know that we are not there yet, that there are high levels of vaccine hesitancy, and private sector has tools within its arsenal that we can use, and we must do that. And I think we are clear on how we can plug in there. Organizations have marketing arms, but also civil society and also religious and faith-based organizations can fold into the mix. But I really must say that Madam Adan Osman, your comments with regards to the systemic and cultural wake-up call is well taken. I haven't really heard anyone speak so eloquently about that in all the different webinars. It's important for Africans to say, hey guys, we have these issues because we haven't addressed systemic problems we've been having for a long time. Let's take this opportunity to address failing healthcare systems that we have ignored. Let's take the facts that our leaders, rich and poor, powerful and weak, all had the same problem with regards to access to oxygen or to ventilators. They couldn't fly for treatment abroad. We need to focus on building capacity locally. And so it means, yes, we have short-term needs, but we do have medium and long-term lessons that we must learn from. And so with that, I want to thank the organizers, the panelists, and the participants, and hand it back to my brother, Amit, for his last comment.
Richard, we are on this for a long haul. We thought we'll do one event, but I think we might need to do a series. It might not be fair for the people who've logged in, and the way I see our interaction, I think if we do 2 or 3 more, to the panelists, we'll reach out to you. Let's keep the conversation going, and we see action on the ground. Talking about next steps, on the next slide, you will see that even when it comes to telehealth, AU and EU are going to have on the margins of the World Health Assembly an amazing telehealth event. So save the date and don't miss it. The slide after 26 May, in June, the East African Ministers of Health have also decided that they are going to transform the region with the EAC Regional Health on telemedicine and e-health. So mark the date on 16th and 17th. Rwanda is actually leading this space. So don't miss it. And then the third one goes to the partnership. The next slide is on 24th June. AHBS will again bring the Minister for Health Liberia, and we will bring USAID, Sanofi Merck, and we'll bring Ministry of Health Ghana, as well as BD, to talk about public-private partnership on beyond the pandemic. What does it mean? Are we ignoring other aspects of the health system? So please save the date, and I'll be reaching out to Ahmed that we might think of a series on an ongoing basis on these vaccine conversations. So Suda, Lolem, Dr. Ahmed Ogwell, and my brother Richard, it has been amazing. And I really want to thank all of you for this wonderful. On the next slide, you can copy the email addresses of Pooja Tank and June Ngina. Write to us your thoughts, your views of how to keep accelerating this vaccine dialogue that we had. Have a great day. Bye for now. Asante sana. Shukran.
Thank you. Thank you. Merci.